Chapter 10 of G.K. Chesterton's Charles Dickens. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. G.K. Chesterton's Charles Dickens. Chapter 10. The Great Dickens Characters. All criticism tends too much to become criticism of criticism, and the reason is very evident. It is that criticism of creation is so very staggering a thing. We see this in the difficulty of criticizing any artistic creation. We see it again in the difficulty of criticizing that creation which is spelt with a capital C. The pessimists who attack the universe are always under this disadvantage. They have an exhilarating consciousness that they could make the sun and moon better, but they also have the depressing consciousness that they could not have made the sun and moon at all. A man looking at a hippopotamus may sometimes be tempted to regard a hippopotamus as an enormous mistake, but he is also bound to confess that a fortunate inferiority prevents him personally from making such mistakes. It is neither a blasphemy nor an exaggeration to say that we feel something of the same difficulty in judging of the very creative element in human literature. And this is the first and last dignity of Dickens, that he was a creator. He did not point out things, he made them. We may disapprove of Mr. Guppy, but we recognize him as a creation flung down like a miracle out of an upper sphere. We can pull him to pieces, but we could not have put him together. We can destroy Mrs. Gamp in our wrath, but we could not have made her in our joy. Under this disadvantage, any book about Dickens must definitely labor. Real primary creation, such as the sun or the birth of a child, calls forth not criticism, not appreciation, but a kind of incoherent gratitude. This is why most hymns about God are bad, and this is why most eulogies on Dickens are bad. The eulogists of the divine and of the human creator are alike inclined to appear sentimentalists, because they are talking about something as very real. In the same way, love letters always sound florid and artificial, because they are about something real. Any chapter such as this chapter must therefore in a sense be inadequate. There is no way of dealing properly with the ultimate greatness of Dickens, except by offering sacrifice to him as a god, and this is opposed to the etiquette of our time. But something can perhaps be done in the way of suggesting what was the quality of this creation. But even in considering its quality, we ought to remember that quality is not the whole question. One of the godlike things about Dickens is his quantity. His quantity as such, the enormous output, the incredible fecundity of his invention. I have said a moment ago that not one of us could have invented Mr. Guppy. But even if we could have stolen Mr. Guppy from Dickens, we have still to confront the fact that Dickens would have been able to invent another quite inconceivable character to take his place. Perhaps we could have created Mr. Guppy, but the effort would certainly have exhausted us. We should be ever afterwards wheeled about in a bath chair at Bournemouth. Nevertheless, there is something that is worth saying about the quality of Dickens. At the very beginning of this review, I remarked that the reader must be in a mood, at least, of democracy. To some it may have sounded irrelevant, but the Revolution was as much behind all the books of the 19th century as the Catholic religion, let us say, was behind all the colours and carvings of the Middle Ages. Another great name of the 19th century will afford an evidence of this, and will also bring us most sharply to the problem of the literary quality of Dickens. Of all these 19th century writers, there is none, in the noblest sense, more democratic than Walter Scott. As this may be disputed, and as it is relevant, I will expand the remark. There are two rooted spiritual realities out of which grow all kinds of democratic conception or sentiment of human quality. There are two things in which all men are manifestly and unmistakably equal. They are not equally clever, or equally muscular, or equally fat, as the sages of the modern reaction, with piercing insight, perceive. But this is a spiritual certainty that all men are tragic, and this, again, is an equally sublime spiritual certainty that all men are comic. No special and private sorrow can be so dreadful as the fact of having to die, and no freak or deformity can be so funny as the mere fact of having two legs. Every man is important if he loses his life, and every man is funny if he loses his hat and has to run after it. And the universal test everywhere of whether a thing is popular of the people is whether it employs vigorously these extremes of the tragic and the comic. Shelley, for instance, was an aristocrat, if ever there was one in the world. He was a republican, but he was not a democrat. In his poetry there is every perfect quality except this pungent and popular stab. For the tragic and the comedy you must go, say, to Burns, a poor man. And all over the world the folk literature, the popular literature, is the same. It consists of very dignified sorrow and very undignified fun. Its sad tales are of broken hearts, its happy tales are of broken heads. These, I say, are two roots of democratic reality. But they have in more civilized literature a more civilized embodiment of form. In literature such as that of the 19th century, the two elements appear somewhat thus. Tragedy becomes a profound sense of human dignity. The other and jollier element becomes a delighted sense of human variety. The first supports equality by saying that all men are equally sublime. The second supports equality by observing that all men are equally interesting. In this democratic aspect of the interest and variety of all men, there is, of course, no democrat so great as Dickens. But in the other matter, in the idea of the dignity of all men, I repeat that there is no democrat so great as Scott. This fact, which is the moral and enduring magnificence of Scott, has been astonishingly overlooked. His rich and dramatic effects are gained in almost every case by some grotesque or beggarly figure rising into a human pride and rhetoric. The common man, in the sense of the paltry man, becomes the common man in the sense of the universal man. He declares his humanity, for the meanest of all the modernities has been the notion that the heroic is an oddity or variation, and that the things that unite us are merely flat or foul. The common things are terrible and startling, death, for instance, and first love. The things that are common are the things that are not commonplace. Into such high and central passions the comic Scott character will suddenly rise. Remember the firm and almost stately answer of the preposterous Nicol Jarvie, when Helen Macgregor seeks to browbeat him into condoning lawlessness and breaking his bourgeois decency. That speech is a great monument of the middle class. Molière made Monsieur Jourdain talk prose, but Scott made him talk poetry. Think of the rising and rousing voice of the dull and gluttonous Athelstane when he answers and overwhelms De Bracy. Think of the proud appeal of the old beggar in The Antiquary when he rebukes the duellists. Scott was fond of describing kings in disguise, but all his characters are kings in disguise. He was, with all his errors, profoundly possessed with an old religious conception, the only possible democratic basis, the idea that man himself is a king in disguise. In all this, Scott, though a royalist and a Tory, had in the strangest way the heart of the Revolution. For instance, he regarded rhetoric, the art of the orator, as the immediate weapon of the oppressed. All his poor men make grand speeches, as they did in the Jacobin Club, which Scott would have so much detested. And it is odd to reflect that he was, as an author, giving free speech to fictitious rebels, while he was, as a stupid politician, denying it to real ones. But the point for us here is that all this popular sympathy of his rests on the graver basis, on the dark dignity of man. "Can you find no way?" asks Sir Arthur Wardour of the beggar when they are cut off by the tide. "I'll give you a farm, I'll make you rich." "Our riches will soon be equal," says the beggar, and looks out across